January 6, 1979. Queens, New York. A cold Saturday night, less than 4 weeks after the biggest cash robbery in American history. A 59-year-old man walks out of his house in Valley Stream, tells his wife he has business to take care of, and gets in his car. His name is Martin Krugman. Everyone calls him Marty. He owns a wig shop on Queens Boulevard called For Men Only. He runs an illegal sports book out of the back room. And 3 weeks earlier, his tip led directly to a robbery crew stealing $5.8 million from Lufthansa's cargo terminal at JFK Airport. Marty never came home that night. His wife friend called every number she had. She called Henry Hill, one of the few people in that world she trusted. Hill told her not to worry, that Marty was probably with a girlfriend, that he'd turn up in a day or two. Already knew Marty wasn't turning up, ever. Marty Krugman built the connections that made the Lufthansa heist possible. Without him, the tip never reaches Jimmy Burke. Without him, there's no getaway van, no $6 million in untraceable cash, no headline that made front pages around the world. In 3 weeks after that money moved, the man who made it happen was dead, cut into pieces, and buried where nobody would ever look. You're going to hear this death happen because he got greedy. That's what the movies tell you. It's not the full story. Marty Krugman didn't die because he asked for money he wasn't owed. He died because he asked, loudly and repeatedly, for money he actually was owed, from a man who had already decided nobody outside his inner circle would live to spend $1 of that heist. This is the story of the man who handed Jimmy Burke $6 million and got a shallow grave for his trouble. To understand why Marty Krugman ended up buried behind a Queens bar, you have to go back to where he came from and how he built the one thing that mattered in that world: connections. Krugman was born in 1919. He grew up working class, moved out to Long Island as an adult, and married a woman named Frances in 1954. For most of his early life, he was nobody in the criminal world. No arrests worth mentioning, no reputation, no crew. He worked a straight job in the hair business for years before he decided to go into business for himself. In 1970, using a bridge loan, Krugman opened a hair salon and wig shop on Queens Boulevard. He called it For Men Only. It sat right next to a nightclub called The Suite, owned by a young hustler named Henry Hill. That single detail, the location of that storefront, changed the entire trajectory of Krugman's life. If he'd opened that shop 3 blocks away, he's a forgotten local business owner who lived a long, quiet life. Instead, he opened it next door to the man who would introduce him to Jimmy Burke, and everything that follows starts right there. Krugman had a talent nobody expected from a wig salesman. He knew how to sell. He filmed his own television commercial, a low-budget local spot that showed him swimming across a pool, while an announcer promised his hairpieces stayed put underwater. It ran late, at night, on New York television for years. It made him a minor local celebrity, and it made his shop profitable enough to expand. He built 2 private back rooms behind heavy curtains where certain customers could talk business without anyone on the sales floor hearing a word. Paul Vario, a capo in the Lucchese crime family and one of the most powerful men Henry Hill answered to, started buying wigs from Krugman when he began going bald. That's how deep this connection ran. The boss of Henry Hill's crew was a paying customer at Marty Krugman's shop. Krugman used those back rooms for something else too. He ran a bookmaking operation, taking bets on sports through a runner named Frank Minna, who collected money and settled debts every week. It wasn't a huge operation. On a good week, Krugman and Minna might clear $12,000 between them. But it put Krugman inside a world of debtors, gamblers, and men who needed things fixed quietly. One of those debtors would end up being the most important person Krugman ever met, and Krugman didn't even know it yet. Jimmy Burke never liked Krugman, not from the start. Burke was an associate of the Lucchese family, a career hijacker, gambler, an enforcer who ran his operation out of a bar in South Ozone Park called Robert's Lounge. Burke believed, without much proof, that Krugman was booking bets out of his shop without paying Burke a cut for the privilege of operating on his turf. He pushed Henry Hill to shake Krugman down for $200 a week in protection money. Hill kept stalling, telling Burke that Krugman's operation wasn't big enough yet to squeeze. That excuse only worked for so long. Burke's resentment toward Krugman had a strange, almost petty source too. Burke suffered from insomnia. When he couldn't sleep, he'd turn on the television, and at 4 in the morning, there was Krugman's wig commercial. Playing on a loop, a man swimming across a pool with a full head of hair he didn't grow himself. Burke would complain to Hill that Krugman had enough money to buy television airtime, but somehow never enough to pay what he owed. It sounds small. It wasn't small to Burke. Men like Burke keep score, and every unpaid debt, real or imagined, went into a ledger that never got erased. Eventually, Burke escalated. He sent Tommy DeSimone and an associate named Danny Rizzo to rough up one of Krugman's employees as a warning. Most men in that world would have paid up after that kind of message. Krugman didn't. He threatened to go to the district attorney. That single decision put a target on his back that never came off, heist or no heist. A man who threatens to talk to prosecutors doesn't get forgiven in that world. He gets marked. At the same time all of this tension was building, a Lufthansa cargo supervisor named Louis Werner was drowning in debt. Werner placed bets through Frank Minna, and those bets flowed up to Krugman. By late 1978, Werner owed Krugman a significant amount of money he had no way to pay. Krugman, sensing an opportunity, had let that debt grow instead of cutting Werner off, hoping it might turn into something more valuable than cash. It did. Werner worked inside Lufthansa's cargo building at JFK, and he knew something almost nobody else knew. Once a month, the airline flew currency into that building from West Germany, cash that came from American servicemen and tourists exchanging money overseas, and that cash sat in a vault overnight before it moved to a bank. Werner offered Krugman the layout, the timing, the security details, everything, in exchange for having his debt forgiven. Krugman took that information straight to Henry Hill. And here's the detail that made all the difference for what came next. Hill knew Burke didn't trust Krugman and wouldn't take a tip from him seriously. So when Hill brought the idea to Burke, he didn't mention where it came from until later. And when he finally did, he made sure Burke understood exactly how much money was on the table. Hill later admitted he put in every zero he could before he ever said Krugman's name. It worked. Burke listened. Burke assembled a crew. Angelo Sepe, Tommy DeSimone, Louis Cafra, Joe Manry, Robert McMahon, Paolo Licastri, Burke's own son Frank, and a gopher named Parnell Edwards were all brought in for different roles. Werner's inside information gave them the layout of the building, the timing of the shipment, the identities of employees who'd be on duty, and the location of the vault. On December 11th, 1978, in the early morning hours, the crew walked into the Lufthansa cargo building at JFK, held the staff at gunpoint, and walked out with roughly $5.8 million in cash and jewelry. At the time, it was the largest cash robbery in United States history. None of it would have happened without a bookmaker's tip that started with a customer's gambling debt. For about a week, everything went according to plan. Then it started falling apart, and it fell apart because of one man's carelessness. Parnell Edwards was supposed to drive the getaway van to a junkyard and have it crushed. Instead, he parked it outside his girlfriend's apartment in Brooklyn and spent the night doing drugs. 2 days later, police ran the plates because the van was blocking a fire hydrant, and it led them straight back to Burke's crew. Fingerprints inside the van gave investigators one of their only real breaks in the entire case. Burke's paranoia, which was already a defining feature of his personality, went into overdrive. On December 18th, exactly 1 week after the robbery, Edwards was shot 5 times in the head inside his own apartment. He was the first of at least 10 people connected to the Lufthansa heist who would be dead within 7 months. Krugman didn't see any of that coming for himself. Why would he? He was the man who started it all. He believed that gave him standing, maybe even protection. He was wrong on both counts. Almost immediately after the heist, Burke made a decision about Krugman that had nothing to do with loyalty and everything to do with liability. According to Hill's later testimony, Burke wanted Krugman dead within days of the robbery, before he'd even collected his own share. The plan Burke put together was simple and cold. Hill would convince Krugman to meet him at the Riviera Motel one Tuesday night, under the pretense of meeting some women there. DeSimone and Sepe would be waiting in the parking lot. Hill, who considered Krugman a genuine friend and whose wife Karen was close with Krugman's wife Fran, spent that entire week trying to talk Burke out of it, stalling, making excuses, buying time he didn't think he actually had. A few hours before Krugman was supposed to walk into that parking lot, Burke told Hill to call it off. Hill never found out exactly why Burke changed his mind that particular night. It didn't matter. It only delayed things. Later that same week, Hill and Krugman were out drinking together, and Krugman, who had no idea how close he'd come to dying in a motel parking lot days earlier, told Hill something that confirmed every suspicion Burke already had about him. Krugman said his cut of the Lufthansa job was supposed to be $500,000. Hill said it was in that moment he finally understood why Burke wanted him gone so badly. It wasn't paranoia about a wig salesman talking too much, although that was part of it. It was money. $500,000 is a number that changes how a man like Burke sees a problem. Krugman wasn't just a loose and who might talk. He was a loose and who wanted a fortune for talking to the right person one time. And Krugman didn't sit quietly waiting for that money. He asked for it. Then he asked again. Then he started asking loudly, the same way he'd once threatened to go to the DA over a roughed-up employee, because that was who Marty Krugman was. He didn't know how to let things go quietly, and he'd never once had to pay for that habit before. He had no way of knowing that the man he was pushing had already tried to have him killed once that same week, and that every phone call demanding a share only made the second attempt more certain. Burke didn't need much more convincing after that. A man who already threatened prosecutors over pocket change was never going to stay quiet about $500,000. A man that loud was a man that talked, eventually, to somebody. Maybe not on purpose. Maybe just because he couldn't stop running his mouth about how much he was owed by who. Burke had watched Krugman's television commercial for years and resented every dollar of it. Now Krugman was demanding real money, the kind that could buy a lot more than airtime, and Burke wasn't going to let that happen twice. On January 6, 1979, Marty Krugman disappeared. The exact details of his final hours were never confirmed by any surviving witness willing to testify to them in open court, but the outline came together over the following year through Henry Hill's cooperation with federal investigators. Krugman left home that Saturday night believing, as far as anyone can tell, that he was heading to a meeting about his money. He never got the meeting he expected. He got Burke and Angelo Sepe instead. Hill later told the FBI that Krugman was killed and dismembered, and that his remains were buried on the property around Robert's Lounge, the same bar where the Lufthansa job had first been discussed, planned, and celebrated. Hill's own son later said he overheard his father telling his mother that Burke and Sepe had, in his words, chopped Krugman into a million pieces. Investigators searched the area around Robert's Lounge based on that testimony. They never found a body. They never found bones. They never found anything they could put in front of a jury. Marty Krugman, the man whose tip made the largest cash heist in American history possible, simply stopped existing, and the ground kept whatever was left of him. His wife friend spent that entire weekend calling everyone she could think of. She called Hill's wife Karen first, then Hill himself, asking if he'd seen Marty, asking if something was wrong. Hill told her to relax, that Marty probably had a girlfriend stashed somewhere and would surface in a few days feeling guilty. Hill knew, at the exact moment he said those words, that Krugman was already dead. He said them anyway, because Burke had told him to, and because keeping Fran calm and confused bought everyone more time before anyone thought to call the police. Fran sold the wig shop later that year. She never got a straight answer from anyone about what happened to her husband. A court finally declared Marty Krugman legally dead in 1986, 7 years after he vanished, using the same standard applied to men lost at sea or swallowed by disasters that leave nothing behind to bury. Krugman was not the last name on that list, and he wasn't even close to the last one killed. What happened to the people around the Lufthansa heist over the following months reads less like a robbery aftermath and more like a purge. Louis Caffra, one of the stick-up men on the actual job, ignored Burke's order not to spend the money conspicuously. He bought his wife Joanna a custom pink Cadillac and drove it near the same JFK cargo area the FBI was already watching. Both Caffra and his wife disappeared entirely. Their bodies were never found either. Joe Manry and Robert McMahon, two of the most trusted men on Burke's crew, Both worked at the airport, and both refused a witness protection deal from the FBI. In May of 1979, they were found shot in the back of the head, sitting together in a parked car, execution style. A month after that, the burned and bullet-riddled body of Paolo Licastri, a Sicilian drug trafficker who'd taken part in the robbery, was found on a burning trash heap in Brooklyn. The killing wasn't limited to the men who pulled the actual job. Richard Eaton and Tom Monteleone, two Florida club owners accused of skimming money that was being laundered through their businesses, were both killed. Children found Eaton's body hogtied and frozen solid inside a refrigerated meat truck. Teresa Ferrara, a woman connected romantically to members of Burke's crew and accused of knowing too much about the skimming operation, was found without her head, washed up on a New Jersey beach. Tommy DeSimone, the same man who'd been standing in that motel parking lot waiting to kill Krugman before the plan got called off, was eventually killed himself. Not over Lufthansa, but because he murdered two Gambino family associates without getting permission first. Angelo Sepe, the man Hill named as Krugman's other killer, lasted 5 more years before his own crime family had him murdered over stolen drug money in 1984. Jimmy Burke was never charged with a single Lufthansa murder, including Krugman's. There was never enough physical evidence, no body, no weapon, no witness willing to testify in open court while Burke was still alive to reach them. What eventually put Burke away was a completely unrelated case, a Boston College basketball point-shaving scheme, built almost entirely on Henry Hill's testimony after Hill entered witness protection in 1980, convinced Burke intended to kill him too. Burke was convicted on conspiracy charges in 1982 and sentenced to 12 years. While already in prison, he was separately convicted of an unrelated murder and given an additional 20 years to life. He died of cancer in 1996 at a prison hospital in Buffalo, New York, 12 years before he would have even been eligible for parole. He never spent a day in prison for Lufthansa. He never spent a day in prison for Marty Krugman. Paul Vario, the capo who greenlit the entire operation and who used to walk into Krugman's shop to buy wig for his own bald head, was convicted separately and died in federal prison in 1989. Louis Werner, the Lufthansa employee whose gambling debt to Krugman started this entire chain of events, was the only person ever convicted directly for the heist itself. He served time and lived quietly afterward, dying in 2007. Henry Hill spent the rest of his life in and out of witness protection, eventually going public with his story, which became the basis for a book and later a film that turned Burke, Vario, and the entire Roberts Lounge crew into household names. Hill died in 2012, the only major figure connected to the Lufthansa heist who lived out a full natural life. Almost $6 million was stolen from that Lufthansa vault in December of 1978. Almost none of it was ever recovered. The man who supplied the very first thread that made the whole operation possible got $500,000 of promises and a spot in the ground behind the same bar where the job was planned over drinks. Nobody was ever charged with his murder. Nobody ever found his body. Marty Krugman spent his entire adult life building relationships with dangerous men because he believed those relationships made him valuable. In the end, that's exactly what got him killed. He wasn't valuable enough to pay. He was only valuable enough to silence.